Over the last year, in a bid to save as much money as possible, I have absolutely overhauled my shopping habits, and by staying consistent with a few simple changes, I've actually managed to cut my food bill by around 50%. And this is all without making huge sacrifices. I still buy organic where I can, but simple changes really can add up. Now, before we jump in, I just want to warn you that you may not hear anything groundbreaking in this video. You may hear tips that you've heard before. I'd certainly heard some of these tips that I'm about to share with you today before, but I just hadn't implemented them. So if nothing else, I hope that by sharing this video, I might just spur you on to maybe try one or two of them and see if they work for you too. So tip number one is to consider switching supermarkets. So I switched from mainly shopping at Tesco to shopping at Lidl about a year ago now, and there are definitely savings that can be made from going to, say, a more budget supermarket. Now, admittedly, these savings are not huge, especially as most of the supermarkets are trying to compete with each other, but some of the savings can add up over time. So for example, a bag of organic carrots is about 89 pence at Lidl versus £1 at Tesco. 6 organic apples about £1.99 at Lidl versus £2.25 at Tesco. So as you can see, we're not talking huge savings, but these are things that I buy pretty much every week. So over the course of a year, those savings could add up to quite a lot of money. So tip number two is to try to cook from scratch. Now, one of the very few upsides of the last year by being at home so much is that I've managed to find additional time to cook from scratch. Now, I've always enjoyed cooking, but I used to tell myself that I just didn't have time to do it, which was utter nonsense, by the way. But by cutting out those processed, pre-prepared meals, I've really noticed the savings. Previously, if I'd had a busy day or something, I would look at a pre-prepared ready meal and think £4.50, that's not too bad for an evening meal. But now I can make something myself and it normally tastes better, much more nutritious, and just, really nice homemade food. And they can be as little as £1.20 a serving, really, really inexpensive. So definitely worth seeing if you can come up with some meals that cost you a lot less. Another upside of this is that I genuinely believe that by cutting out a lot of the processed foods, that this has contributed to my recent £40 weight loss. So tip number three is to consider batch cooking. Now, I'm sure this is a tip that you've heard before. I know I definitely had. I just never really done it. I felt like it probably wasn't for me because I don't have children, but how wrong I was, because ever since I've been cooking from scratch, I found it so easy to just double up a recipe and kind of make additional portions and then just freeze those for another day. Now, not only does that mean that you're only cooking once, but on those days when you really cannot be bothered to cook, it's so easy to avoid ordering junk or buying something pre-prepared, which is going to be considerably more expensive. I can just go into the freezer and I know that in a really short space of time, I'm going to be able to have a meal that is tasty, nutritious, and that I'll enjoy. Tip number four is to have a few go-to meals. Now, leading really nicely on from batch cooking and cooking from scratch is to just learn how to cook a few meals that you will always enjoy. Now, it sounds a bit boring to eat the same things relatively regularly, but honestly, if you enjoy them, it's not boring at all. And what I've found is that by having a few go-to meals that I know I will always enjoy, it kind of helps me plan what I'm going to buy a lot better, and it also avoids letting any food go to waste. For me, my go-tos are things like casseroles, soups, veggie curries, cottage pies, bolognese, etc. These are all things that can be cooked from scratch, cooked as a batch, and can freeze really well and reheat really well. So yeah, I just find having a few go-to meals really, really helps. Tip number five is increase the veg. Now, without getting into any ethical argument about what people should or shouldn't eat, I am not currently vegan or vegetarian, but a couple of years ago, I started to massively reduce the amount of meat I eat per week. And since cooking from scratch, I've probably done this even more so. Doing this is definitely a money saver, and it also allows me to buy the highest quality, highest welfare I possibly can if and when I do buy meat. But in all honesty, I actually prefer some of my meat-free versions of things now. I actually think in some ways they can be tastier. Things like veggie curries are just as tasty as the meat versions. Veggie soups are super easy to make and very cheap per portion. Bulking out pretty much any recipe with veg will help to not only create additional portions, but also drive down the cost per portion. Now, if you're not quite ready to give up your meat yet, then consider adapting the recipe. So if you're making something like a chicken curry, consider using half half the amount of chicken you would use and then bulking out the rest with veg. Or another example, something like a bolognese, if the recipe calls for 500 grams of mince, I will use 250 grams and then put in a can of green lentils. This obviously reduces your meat, but also saves money because a can of lentils is around 60 pence, whereas the meat would be much more expensive. You can do the same with cottage pies, etc., and it tastes just as lovely. And but you're still getting the protein if that's something that you're worried about, but it's driving the cost down. With a quick search online, you can also find lots of meat-free recipes for kind of classic meals, things like veggie shepherd's pies, veggie ragouts, etc., etc. And these can be genuinely really, really tasty and obviously much cheaper to produce. Tip number 6 is to consider shopping just once a week. So pre-pandemic, I used to be one of these people who would pretty much drop into the supermarket on my way home from work every day. But over the last year, in part to reduce my social contact, I've only been shopping once a week, sometimes once a fortnight. And I really do think this has saved me money because not only am I using up what I have, but also I'm not being seduced by offers, buying things I don't need, or buying expensive ready meals because I've had a long day, or picking up that extra bar of chocolate because I feel like I want to treat myself. So I'm really not buying things that I don't need. Tip number 7 is to consider eating seasonally. Now, I do have other motivations for this, things like wanting to support local and British farming, potentially reducing carbon footprint, etc. But I do think that eating seasonally can work out slightly cheaper. For example, it's generally cheaper to buy strawberries in July when they're in season than it is to buy them in December. It's also really easy to just have a quick look online, work out what's in season, and then look out for it when you're in store. One other side benefit I found from this is that in-season produce, particularly things like cauliflower, squash, root veg, etc., tends to be less likely to be packaged in plastic when it's in season. And I'm really trying to reduce plastic where I can. So that's just been a really nice benefit for me personally. There also may be even health benefits from eating seasonally. Some scientists feel that eating seasonally can help our microbiome. Tip number 8 is if you buy it, use it. So I've always hated food waste. I think it's so bad that when there's such food insecurity in certain parts of the world, that here in the UK, literally millions of tons of food ends up in landfill every single day. And even I have to admit that before I changed the way that I shop and ate, that I could be guilty of a little bit of food waste from time to time. Now, I found that most of the time that happened was when I looked in the fridge, I would see something that needed using up and I would say, oh, but I don't fancy that. But now I just don't allow myself that privilege. If it needs using, I will create a meal from it. And what I found is that actually by the time I've started preparing that, by the time I've started cooking it and it's smelling nice, that by the time it's ready, I actually do fancy that. And then I really enjoy it. So I've just reduced that food waste. And obviously by reducing waste, you're going to reduce the amount of spend each week. Alternatively, if I am worried that something might go off before I have chance to use it, then I'll generally prep it and freeze it. Things like veg freeze really well. And although you kind of have to use it differently once it's been frozen, if you're going to put it into a soup or into a casserole or mash it, etc., then it really doesn't matter. Things like fruit can be frozen and then thrown into a smoothie so that you really, really reduce the waste that you have. Reports suggest the average family in the UK throws away around £400 to £700 worth of food every year that was still edible. That is just crazy to me, and not a small amount of money to the average person either. Money that could be utilised in much better ways. Tip number 9, don't shop when you are hungry. Now, I'm sure you've heard this tip before. I know I definitely had, but the reason it's trotted out so often is for valid reason. I know when I'm shopping and hungry, I'm much more likely to reach for those kind of processed, pre-prepared, snack type foods because I'm really looking for that quick fix. There's now several studies that show that we are all pretty much susceptible to this. When shopping, when hungry, you're much more likely to pick up those kind of high calorie, adulterated foods. And these offer generally much less value than buying produce and then kind of cooking from scratch yourself. Okay, so I'll stop there. I'm sure there will be things I've missed out out, but if I don't stop now, this video will be super long. If there are any that I remember, I will pop them in the comments below. If there's any tips that you have, please pop those in the comments as well. I'm sure that any tips that you share will be helpful to someone. If you have made it this far, thank you so much for watching. As always, if you haven't subscribed already, consider doing so, and I will look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye now. Mwah.